Howdy, folks. This is Joe Duffy, CEO of OffshoreInsiders.com. On this video, we're going to talk about the NBA playoffs. It is NBA playoff time, and so often we preach exploiting the myths out there. And one of those biggest myths out there is the quote-unquote defense wins, especially in the postseason. That is not true at all in the NBA. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Points are a commodity. And the tougher a commodity is to come by, the more value it is. Defensive intensity goes up in the postseason, which means teams that can score points become that much more value. But one of the major reasons for this big misconception about defense wins, the media says it, everyone regurgitates it, is because of the fantasy basketball mentality, or in the case of football, we have a similar philosophy in football, which we'll talk about on a future video. But just about everybody, when they think of a great offense, they think of a team that scores a lot of points. Points per game is much more about pace than it is effectiveness. Quite the contrary. We identify a great offense as a team that can score in the half court and that they value their possessions. In fact, we use a statistic which is called wasted points. A team that has the fewest wasted points is actually the best offense. Let me give you an example of how that actually works. Each possession is worth 2 points. Now, we realize that you could score 3, and in fact, in some cases, you could actually score, 4 points on a possession, but it doesn't really matter as long as the number is standard. So, if a team has 50 possessions in a game, a quote-unquote perfect score would be if they had 80 points. Now, let's just say that that team, a half-court game like, for example, the San Antonio Spurs, they had 50 possessions, they scored 80 points. That would be 20 wasted points. Now, let's talk about an up-tempo team like the New York Knicks or, Phoenix when they were coached by Mike D'Antoni. In fact, Phoenix still. A high-paced team that gets 65 possessions a game. A perfect score would be 130 points. Now, let's just say they get 100. That would be 30 wasted points. Now, most of the rest of the world would say, wait a minute. The fast-paced team, Team B, is the much better offense because they average 100 points, while Team A only averages 80 points. We say balderdash. Team A is, in fact, the much better offense because they waste only 20 points, while the up-tempo team waste only 30 points. So teams that can get points when the defensive intensity is there in the half court are the great offensive teams. So we would consider Greg Popovich a great offensive coach, in college basketball Tom Izzo, and I consider Mike D'Antoni to be a terrible offensive coach because he wastes points. And the same thing when it comes to football, Mike Martz, but that's another story altogether. Now, you don't believe me that offense wins in the postseason based on our definition? Again, talent, not the pace, not the system, is how we identify great offenses. Let's just take a look at the NBA champions in recent years. Of course, last year, Paul Gasol became a legitimate, big-time number 2 threat with Kobe Bryant, and what happens? The Lakers win the championship. Now, if you look at those mere points per game statistics, you would think that the San Antonio Spurs were a defensive-oriented team. Quite the opposite. They do not waste their possessions. They have a fantastic 1-2-3 punch. Tony Parker, Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili. Any one of those guys would be the number 1 option on most of the other teams in the NBA, but they value their possessions. Of course, the Heat, Shaquille O'Neal, Dwayne Wade. Great 1-2 punch. They didn't play that wide open style in the mere points per game. For the fantasy basketball geeks, they may not have looked like a great offense. The fact that they were. Jordan and Pippen, pretty good, I think. Scottie Pippen would have been the number 1 option on probably 95% of the teams in the history of the NBA. Houston Rockets, Olajuwon, Drexler, Cassell. Remember the Detroit Pistons of 2004? Again, everyone talked about what great defense they played. They're pretty talented on offense. Chauncey Billups, Rick Hamilton. In fact, their number 3 scorer was Rasheed Wallace, a 7-footer who could drain 3-point shots. Tayshaun Prince, in fact, was their number 4 scorer. So again, Teams that go deep into the postseason are able to score in the half court. Usually their number 3 scorer would be the number 1 option on a lot of teams. Their number 2 scorer certainly would be. It is offense that wins in the postseason. And our record speaks for itself. Virtually every year, we've hovered around the 60% mark in the NBA, going back to my score phone days as JD of the ACC. So again, offshoreinsiders.com is the place to be for the NBA playoffs, just like it was for the NBA regular season, just like it was for March Madness. Again, offshoreinsiders.com.